He had tried to get the states to adopt a uniform narcotic law, which would include cannabis, and that would allow each state to decide how much of its resources it wanted to put out for the control of marijuana or cannabis, and it wouldn't touch his budget or his agents. That had some success, but not complete. There was continued pressure on the government in Washington to do something about these Mexican immigrants who smoked marijuana and went into town on the weekends and created havoc.
Texas, California, Arizona, and Colorado insist it's the federal government's responsibility to do something, but Anslinger resists. He has no interest in staking a career on combating a weed. He has only a staff of 300 and a $1.5 million budget to battle drugs the world over. He wants to avoid a law that will be difficult to enforce and offers a different approach.
He wanted silence. If you had to say something, you made it sound as awful as possible.
And I say marijuana is a killer drug.
But by and large, there was nothing they could do about it. There was no real big action. They didn't have the funding. They didn't have the people. And I remember he said to me once, I was driving around the upper Potomac, and I was crossing the bridge, and I just parked on the bridge, and I got out and I looked, and there was marijuana plants as far as you could see. And he said, I said to myself, and they want me to wipe this out.
Anslinger can do nothing to stop the push from states of the Southwest for a federal law against marijuana. The issue is less about the dangers of the drugs and more about politics. Marijuana is entangled in immigration problems.
I remember when I interviewed Harry Anslinger about it, he said we weren't having any trouble with it. You could get it in Harlem, he said, and it was not a problem. But the pressure came from the Southwest and the West, where the Mexican immigrants were seen as a unnecessary and dangerous surplus population. And so there was a tremendous campaign to try to push the Mexican immigrants back into Mexico. And marijuana got mixed up in that, because there was no question that they grew marijuana and smoked marijuana.
In the end, the southwestern states prevail upon Anslinger to do something. Hesitant as he may have been, the pressure is on for Anslinger to use the power of the federal government to control marijuana. Ever the bureaucrat, Anslinger changes his position and becomes a leading warrior against marijuana.
The Treasury Department intends to pursue a relentless warfare against the despicable, dope-peddling vulture who preys on the weakness of his fellow man.
His chief weapons are movies that express exaggerated dangers of the drug.
The truth is that every reefer is loaded with immorality and bestial perversions, brutality, murder, sex crimes, insanity, or suicide.
While a propaganda war against marijuana is underway, Anslinger begins working to draft a law. But what kind of law? Like all federal drug prohibition in the early 20th century, the Constitution stands in the way. He finds a way around that in a new law passed to ban machine guns.
A law was passed called the National Firearms Act, which said that you could not give, borrow, or transfer a machine gun to anyone without a machine gun transfer stamp. And it turns out the government would not make any machine gun transfer stamps. So this went up to the Supreme Court on the grounds that this couldn't be legitimate taxing measure because they weren't doing anything to get the taxes. It was actually just a way to stop machine guns being distributed.
The Supreme Court ruled the National Firearms Act was legal, and its use of stamps, even though purposely not available, was legitimate. Anslinger now has a model for a national ban against marijuana.
Anslinger told me that the general counsel of the Treasury Department came into his office holding this decision by the Supreme Court, saying, look, we have a way to go after marijuana.
Anslinger's idea to make marijuana illegal is simple. Anyone involved in its use, distribution, sale, or transfer will be required to get from the government a marijuana tax stamp. But the catch is, the government will only make a token number of tax stamps available. But can he convince Congress that a weed is as dangerous as a machine gun?
The next tragedy may be that of your daughter.
or your son, or yours, or yours, or yours.
The History Channel now returns to Hooked, illegal drugs and how they got that way.
On April 27, 1937, hearings begin before Congress on the first federal law to control marijuana. Anslinger hopes to convince Congress that marijuana is dangerous and that they will enact a law like the one that banned machine guns.
I think his attitude toward marijuana was that it was not as serious as cocaine and heroin. But you wouldn't know that publicly, because one of the strategies against marijuana was to describe it in so horrible and disgusting a way that no one would be tempted to try it once.
What's the matter with you, son?
Anslinger tells Congress the drug makes the user insane, or worse.
Oh, nuts. I didn't do it on purpose. Of course you did. But rather than argue with them, the mother stoops to pick it up, and when she does, Elvin takes that heavy frying pan from the stove and kills his mother with it. This is exactly what happened, and how it happened. In fact, he said...
Anslinger also tells Congress marijuana is the stepping stone or gateway to heroin and cocaine.
One more puff, or I'll be floating.
I want something stronger. How much have you got?
He adds that it is the assassin of youth.
One of the cases that he was constantly presenting in these congressional hearings was the case of Victor Licata, who was a young boy in Florida who cut up his family with an axe. And according to Harry Anslinger, he did this after smoking a marijuana joint. He then went out and chopped up his mother and father.
But what Anslinger omitted in his testimony, as was published several days later in the Tampa newspaper, that Licata was probably schizophrenic, and there's very little probability that marijuana was the cause and effect of the terrible crime he committed.
Not a very nice thing to look at, but this is marijuana, and there's nothing beautiful about marijuana. Well, the officer drew his gun, reached for the closet door, and pulled out Victor.
Anslinger tells Congress that school children are using marijuana. That assertion results in the only testimony against the law. Dr. William Woodward of the American Medical Association testifies that for all the complaints about marijuana's danger to school children, there was no evidence to back it up. Congress disregards his testimony.
They just attacked him viciously. They said, how can you come down here trying to interrupt us when we're trying to do something good for the American people and so forth? Well, it turns out their argument with him had nothing to do with marijuana. They just chopped him into pieces and verbally excoriated him in front of this congressional hearing and then lied about what he said.
Hearst follows the hearings, adding extra newspaper runs to cover the news in Washington and headlining the evils of marijuana. Across America, independent movies add to the propaganda, bombarding the public. The most famous, Reefer Madness, warns of the perils of smoking marijuana, as stated by Anslinger and Hearst.
Just take a puff of it.
Didn't come from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, but Anslinger's bureau did endorse it. He did support it. In fact, in the opening scene, when the high school principal is talking to an audience of parents, he refers to the Bureau of Narcotics several times.
On Capitol Hill, Anslinger wins. Congress passes the Marijuana Tax Act, the first federal law against the drug. The Southwest gets the federal law they wanted. After 5 days of hearings, the marijuana tax law goes to Congress for a vote. It's passed within weeks by roll call vote. President Roosevelt signs the bill on August 2nd. It takes effect October 1st.
Perhaps one of Anslinger's most significant contributions to fighting drugs is that he, more than any other individual, demonized drugs. I don't know that Anslinger lied to Congress, but he was an effective propagandist, we might say.
The law requires that anyone wishing to buy, sell, distribute, or transfer marijuana must pay a tax and have a stamp. The penalty for failure to do so is 5 years in jail, a $2,000 fine, or both. But like the machine gun law, the government doesn't make the marijuana stamps available.
There was another problem, too, and that was that in order to get the license, you had to have the marijuana in hand. But if you had the marijuana in hand without the license, you had already violated the law.
2 days after the law goes into effect, the first offender of the Marijuana Tax Act, Samuel Caldwell, is arrested in Colorado. 4 days later, he is convicted and sentenced to 4 years in jail and a $1,000 fine. Anslinger flies in from Washington to see justice done. So begins the federal government's effort to punish marijuana users.